Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this lecture of our Great Books series. It's our graduate seminar in our wisdom school where once a month we convene a 90-minute lecture in the form of a graduate seminar. And we contemplate great books that have influenced history or that carry a deep truth that is important for the moment for us to understand so that we can take more prudent actions in the world. We've covered all kinds of great books, East and West, modern and ancient, over the last 4 or 5 years. I have chosen for this great book not to choose a great book. This is the first time I haven't done one of the great works of human literature. But I've chosen a work that probably in even 10 years won't be remembered, but is very salient today. And that is a book by Tim Marshall called Prisoners of Geography. And it was recommended to me by Georgie Szabo as we were talking one day about the escalating war in Ukraine. So I read it and was fascinated by it. It's written very simply. You can breeze through it in a couple of sittings. So it's not an erudite book. I think it's very much written for the person at airports that just wants something interesting, but it carries a very profound message that I believe is urgently necessary to insert in our global conversation as we escalate toward war. As you all know, I believe that we're in the most dangerous moment in our lifetime, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the world came within a hair's breadth of going to nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, between the United States and Russia. And 60 years later, we're back at it as the two superpowers are squaring off. And understanding the geography, which is the central point of Tim Marshall's book, and that if you understand the geography of a region, you understand the culture, you understand the language, you understand the politics, the economics, and the history. That we're all prisoners of geography. We can't get out of where we are. So I was just talking with Georg Bock, our director of technology and many other things, and he's in Germany. He's in Berlin. Well, if you're a German, you have been in a geographical frame that has made you susceptible to invasion, and it's made it easy for you to invade. Because Europe, with the exception of the Alps in Switzerland, essentially, and the Pyrenees between France and Germany, is a great plain. And there are hills and there are certainly mountains, but basically the landmass from France, Germany, eastward into Poland, into Russia, you get finally 1,000, 2,000 miles later to the Ural Mountains, which are small, low mountains. And then it's basically a plain all the way across Siberia to the Pacific. So where we're born determines to a significant degree who we are, particularly if you look at not so much individuals, but at cultures. So last time I really looked at the situation in Ukraine and how the geography of the Ukraine made it so susceptible to being the crossroads. Ukraine is a great step. There's no natural boundaries. And so Ukraine is one of those regions in the world. In fact, the name Ukraine means crossroads. It's the place where empires and peoples and migrating tribes and different political empires have held sway and finally left as replaced by someone else. And there's a great war now in the formation in that region as Russia has sought to secure a land bridge to Crimea, where it has a major naval base so that it can secure its access to the Black Sea. And the history of that region is a region that's fraught with both cross-civilizational communication and conflict. As opposed to if you're in Switzerland. Switzerland has almost never been invaded. Even the Germans didn't take on the Swiss in the Second World War, because it's all mountains. It's almost impossible to invade. So the Swiss have been protected by the mountains and have been blithely neutral for most of their history, because they know that whatever's going on around them, they're basically insulated by geography. So today we're going to delve more into the different regions of the world. And I want to start where I left off last time. And then we're going to go to different parts of the world. And we're going to look at the geography and how the geography has determined what they've become. We focused on Ukraine last time. I want to now focus on Russia, because Russia is one of the two great protagonists as the Americans and the Russians square off about whether the Russians have the power to gain the access to the Black Sea, or whether they're going to be cut off or destroyed by the American expansion of NATO to the east. Because Russia is unprotected from Europe, because it's part of a single landmass, and armies and trade can sweep back and forth. Russia has been invaded on average once every 34 years since the Poles first invaded Russia through the great Northern European plain in 1605. And then in 1707, Charles XII from Sweden went across the same plain and attacked Russia and was repulsed. And then Napoleon in 1812 attacked Russia across the very same Northern European plain, burnt down Moscow, or rather the Russians burnt down Moscow so Napoleon wouldn't have any food or shelter. And Napoleon was repulsed, and Napoleon fell and was exiled because of the calamitous mistake he made in invading Russia. And then in the First World War, the Germans invaded Russia and were directly responsible for the collapse of the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years. And out of that came the Bolshevik revolution. It was the Germans that secreted Vladimir Lenin, who was hiding in exile from the Russian Tsarist government in Switzerland. It was the Germans that allowed Lenin to go across the great northern plain up into Finland and then come down into what is now Leningrad. And the Russians, as you all know, were vanquished in that war as the regime collapsed. The Germans then lost. And then in the Second World War, the Germans again invaded Russia with an intent to destroy it, attacked Petersburg, St. Petersburg in the north, where over 1 million people were killed. Moscow, they got to the outskirts of Moscow and were held back. And then, of course, the great Battle of Stalingrad, where the Russians stood firm. And when the Germans were defeated, as Winston Churchill said, we have reached the end of our beginning, because he could see, as everyone could see, that at that moment, as the Germans were defeated by the Russians in the Battle of Stalingrad, that it was basically over for the Third Reich. It took another couple years to vanquish them, but it was the Russians that made the decisive move. And then in 1989, after the Russians captured much of Eastern Europe, and again, easily did so because there's no natural geographic barriers. And then Gorbachev said, we'll withdraw if the Americans do not push NATO and military power to the east. The United States, as you all know from my previous lectures and just information through history, violated that and have been pushing. And now the United States has had the advantage of every other empire and has swept. And now the United States controls all of Europe. So if you look at a map from France and Spain all the way now to the borders of Russia, the United States military controls it all. And they have every intent on seizing Ukraine, cutting Russia off from Crimea, and breaking up Russia. This is very important for all of us to take in as we seek to understand what's going on in Russia, what's going on in the mind of Vladimir Putin. That the archetypal patterning of attack from the West, the ability of the Russians to endure, slowly pushing back the invader, is the deepest archetypal pattern in Russian history in its relationship to Western Europe. And this is really important for us to understand in terms of understanding the mind of Putin, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and the Russian psyche, and the military, the Russian people, the Russian government, the governing elite, is that what has been activated by the American attempt to seize Ukraine, cut Russia off from Crimea, and destroy Russia, which is what the neoconservatives in the US government have been talking about for the last 30 years, is the capacity of the Russians to endure. And that's why I've said in my various teach-ins and blogs that what is happening right now is that the irresistible force of American expansion through NATO is meeting the immovable object of Russian nationalism. That's what's being played out in Ukraine. Ukraine is not about the Ukrainians fighting the Russians and we need to support them. That's just propaganda. That's just a typical imperial move, but in this case, the American imperium using a proxy like the Ukrainians to do battle against an enemy that they're seeking to destroy. And the United States is going to fight to the last Ukrainian. And the Russians understand that. And so does much of the rest of the world. So in contemplating what's going on right now between America and Russia, and be in the great battlefield of Ukraine, it is very important that we understand that geography is at play. And geography being as it is, the Russians, once again, know that they're meeting an enemy that seeks to destroy them, and they have to stand firm. And that's why Putin has said that to defend what they've taken as the land bridge to Crimea, to secure their access to the Black Sea, Russia will use nuclear weapons. And just like in Stalingrad, just like in the battles around Moscow, just like in the Battle of Leningrad during the Second World War, the Russians have an inordinate capacity to endure. And that's what's true. Now, let me juxtapose that with the United States, which is the opposite. The United States, and I want to read you what Tim Marhsall says about the U.S. It's on page 68 if you want to track it. Location, location, location. If you won the lottery, he says, and we're looking to buy a country to live in, the first one the real estate agent would show you would be the United States of America. And he basically makes the point in this chapter, there is no place on planet Earth that has been more generously endowed by geography to be a great, prosperous power. I want you all now just to picture the United States. First of all, critical to understanding the United States in terms of geography is that it's cut off from the rest of the world by two great oceans. Russia has no barrier. It has no ocean to protect it from Europe. Doesn't even have a river. The United States has been protected by two great oceans since its inception. Nobody's ever attacked the United States. The Japanese got as far as Pearl Harbor in Hawaii during the Second World War, but they did one attack and that was it. So in the first instance, location, location, location. You want to be in a place that people can't attack. So it's sort of like Switzerland, but the US has vast oceans. Secondly, the Mississippi Basin, which is the vast river system, about 1/3 of the way across the United States, if you're moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific, has more tributaries and more rivers feeding into it than any other river system in the world, which allows for irrigation, it allows for trade, and it goes from the top of the United States all the way down from the Great Lakes, all the way down to New Orleans, where the Mississippi empties into the Gulf of Mexico. You have the Rocky Mountains, but in the middle, you've got the huge plain, one of the greatest agricultural areas in the world. And then, of course, in California, the great Central Valley in California. So you have more arable land. And when the European settlers came, starting in the, let's talk about the 1620 when the Pilgrims landed, and so let's just say the 17th, 18th century when the French and the British and Spanish were coming into that area. The Native Americans, through horticulture, had been doing controlled burnings and had created literally a paradise from sea to shining sea. So when the Europeans conquered them, they found agricultural land that was the richest in the world. So what they needed were more Europeans. So the United States has the distinction, again, because of geography, of being the only country in history that we know of that was built not by people who were there. We killed them all off, basically. We committed genocide against the indigenous peoples. We brought in Black Africans from Africa, but we then welcomed Europeans to come in to settle the land. So the United States is the only country in history that was essentially populated by people coming from somewhere else. And that created a great melting pot. And out of that diversity was built the American nation and the American empire. Now, very importantly, as a result of geography, the United States has been a naval power. It has to be. Because it is not only protected by geography, but it's also separated by geography. So from the very beginning, the United States has developed a navy, and it's gone all over the world to bring in goods and create markets and so forth. And what it has done from the very beginning, because of its great power of technology and the fact that it had no natural enemies, either domestic or foreign, it very quickly, within less than 50 years of its inception in 1776, say, when it finally really became independent in 1783, 40 years later, in 1823, the fifth American president, John Monroe, declared the Monroe Doctrine, that the entire Western Hemisphere was off limits to any foreign power for military purposes. I want everybody to take in the chutzpah of that. Here you have a small little country. You still have the Spanish and the Portuguese that control Central and Latin America. The British still control Canada, because Canada hadn't quite got formulated yet. But the US elite understood that they were on a gold mine, and that the first thing that needed to happen was that they had to ensure that no other foreign powers would take in any part of the entire Western Hemisphere. So that is really, really important to understand. That since 1823, the United States has exercised economic and military control of the entire Western Hemisphere, and sent its vast navies around the world to secure products that it brought back to the center. It's been a classic empire. It has a very strong center, the USA, and then peripheral states that feed into the imperium. It's very, very classic. The basic architecture of empire is a center and periphery, and the manipulation of the peripheral regions through economic and military power to feed the wealth of the center, so that by the end of the Second World War, when the American century began, as they say, the United States constituted 6% of the world's population, but it consumed about 25% of all the resources of the world. And the fact that that impoverished most of the rest of the world was of little account, because from the point of view of the center of the imperium, creating more and more wealth inside the United States was the goal of the exercise. So beginning in 1945, the US had at that time 1,200 military bases all over the world. Now they have about 800. But the Central Command, which is based in the Middle East, basically is the hub of the American wheel, imperial wheel. So that as a nation separated by oceans, but is fundamentally the wealthiest spot maybe in the world, geographically endowed, the US has maintained for the last 75 years its imperial sway through the primacy of the US dollar, which beginning in 1972, it secured to oil. So wherever oil sold until just recently, because of the war in Ukraine, oil was sold in US dollars. And that's one reason why the world is saturated with fossil fuel, because every time you buy a tank of gas, every time you buy petrol, you're supporting the primacy of the US dollar. And then backing up that primacy is this grid of 800 military bases. And then, of course, military satellites and a capacity of space warfare to take out any spot of the planet at any time, given a decision by the United States. So to circle back to Ukraine, after the Second World War, the United States consolidated its imperium, think Rome, on Western Europe and built this NATO alliance. And then when the Russians, thinking they had an agreement with the United States, withdrew from Eastern Europe, the United States, this is the neoconservatives, said they're weak. We can take over all of Europe and we can break up Russia. And if the United States succeeds in taking over all of Europe and breaking up Russia, we can control the entire northern hemisphere and secure American supremacy. That's what's being played out in Ukraine. And that's why Russia, taking its last stand on this land bridge to Crimea, so that in the face of this US expansionism, at least it secures its access to the Black Sea, is basically what is happening. Everything else is detail. So let's turn to Africa. That's a very interesting place as well. And it's in some ways the opposite of Russia. Very well endowed, vast, 6 million square miles is Russia. It's the largest country in the world. You could fit the entire United States twice or 3 times into Russia, Canada, China as well. It's vast. And then there's Africa, which is bigger than all of them, but has played almost no role in human affairs, and has been vanquished for the last 500 years, and currently is unable to really govern itself because of the neo-colonial policies reinforced by the United States through the international instruments of the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT and the WTO that have decimated Africa and created what they call export platforms. So Ghana produces coffee. just like Ecuador produces bananas, and they tell these countries what they're going to produce, pay them a pittance, and then extract the coffee and the bananas to the European and American markets. Why was Africa unable to resist? Geography. So again, I'll just read a few sections from Tim Marshall. If you look at Africa's coastline, they have great beaches, he says. Really, really lovely beaches, but terrible natural harbors. Rivers, amazing rivers, but most of them are worthless for actually transporting anything, given that every few miles you go over a waterfall. There are just two in a long, these are just two in a long list of problems that help explain why Africa isn't technologically or politically as successful as Western Europe or North America. There are lots of places that are unsuccessful, but there are only few that are as unsuccessful as Africa. And that despite having a head start as the place where our species, Homo sapiens, emerged approximately 200,000 years ago, Africa is an unsuccess story par excellence. And almost the entire continent developed in isolation from the Eurasian landmass. And the reason for this, as Tim Marshall explains, is very simple. Even though you could fit the United States 3 times into Africa, it's a massive continent, currently has 56 nations in the African continent. Because it doesn't have any natural harbors to speak of. You've got Alexandria in Egypt at the mouth of the Nile River, but that is always silting up and isn't considered a great harbor. You've got Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa, but if you look at that, that's not a great harbor either. And that's one reason why the Europeans wanted to get around Africa so they could get to Asia, because they sailed down the west coast of Africa, but they couldn't find any natural harbors. Extraordinary how geography determines history. And even if you go up the east coast of Africa, there are harbors, but nothing like London, nothing like New York, nothing like Shanghai, etc. So Africa was in some ways immune, but it also then couldn't and never had the trading mechanism that was so essential over the centuries in enabling ideas to be exchanged, goods to be exchanged, and so forth. Secondly, the rivers. When you go to Europe, the Rhine and the Danube and the Dnieper and all these other rivers, they're all crisscrossing. They're all connected. They built canals, and there are no waterfalls in Europe. There may be 1 or 2 little peewee ones, but there's nothing like Victoria Falls on the Zambezi. People come from all over the world as tourists to see the waterfalls in Africa. And that's great for a photograph, but it isn't great for trade. And furthermore, none of these major rivers hook up. So in Africa, that great landmass, you have in geographic inhibitors because of no harbors externally, And internally, because of the river systems and because the cataracts of the Nile and so forth and so on, and all the great waterfalls and the fact that they don't hook up, you have a huge landmass that is incapable of either internal or external development. So when the Europeans came in, and this is the third great tragedy, which was political, of Africa, they simply carved it up, like Churchill after World War I carved up the Middle East and condemned an entire continent to perpetual civil war and turmoil, as the Europeans sitting in Paris or Berlin or London took out these maps and said, okay, you take the X, I'm going to take Y, and they drew with a compass. You look at many of the countries in Africa, and they're straight lines. They were drawn in European capitals without any regard of the ethnic definition and assemblage of the country. And that's why, since independence in the 1960s and 70s, most of Africa has been in civil war, because of the maps the Europeans drafted put antagonistic tribes together in a forced unity that didn't hold. So look at Rwanda, where the Hutus and the Tutsis, the Hutus butchered upwards of 1,000 Tutsis just 30 years ago with machetes. Look at Biafra in Nigeria, where the Nigerian government starved millions of people to death. All Biafra wanted, having no connection with Nigeria, they wanted to be their own country. Look what's happening in Ethiopia today. That's been the result of the colonial period, so that if you do the maps, combined with economic and political exploitation and the deliberate policy refined most quintessentially by the British of divide and conquer. Look at what they did between Pakistan and India. They deliberately fomented hostility between the Muslims and the Hindus, so that as they were leaving in the independence of 1948, basically India fell into civil war as a specific strategic intent of the withdrawing British. So Africa continues to be plagued by its geography, and that's why Tim Marshall uses the term prisoners. We're all prisoners of geography. And the Africans have been torturously afflicted by the geographic constraints that reduce them technically and politically incapable of withstanding the onslaught of colonization, which then compounded the subordination and the suffering through the artificial construction of the borders, through the slave trade, through neo-colonialism that we see even to the present time. And if you want the example, probably the heart of darkness, as Conrad put it in his great work on at the time, the Belgian Congo, now called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's a sore spot on the conscience of humanity that is being played out today, where the European powers seeking to extract minerals that are needed for our iPhones, and our high-tech economies rape and pillage Congo and ensure that the Congolese cannot fight back by perpetuating sustained civil war between the tribes as a conscious exercise of policy coming from Europe. That's how geography gets played out as tragedy in the Congo. It's a tragedy beyond bearing. So finally, I want to turn to Latin America. In Latin America, is a very interesting parallel, but in a very different way to Africa. And in the beginning of the chapter on Latin America, Tim Marshall quotes Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet and Nobel laureate. He says, Latin America is very fond of the word hope. We like to be called the continent of hope. This hope is like a promise of heaven, an IOU whose payment is always put off. It is put off until the next legislative campaign, until next year, until the next century. That is the history of Latin America. In perpetual hope, and yet never being able to grasp it and bringing it into reality. And he points out a little different version of the same story as Africa, that the limitations of Latin America's geography were compounded right from the beginning in the formation of nation states. In the United States, once the land had been taken from its original inhabitants, the genocide against the Native Americans, much of it was sold or given away to small landholders. In contrast, in Latin America, the old world culture of powerful landowners and serfs, the Spanish-Portuguese model, was imposed, which led to inequality. On top of this, the European settlers introduced another geographical problem that to this day holds many Latin American countries back from developing their full potential. They stayed on the coasts, especially, as we saw in Africa, in regions where the interior was infested by mosquitoes and disease. Most of the country's biggest cities, often the capitals, are therefore near the coasts, and all roads from the interior were developed to connect the capital, but not to connect to the capital, but not to one another. The colonialists concentrated on getting wealth out of each region to the coast and back to Europe. And in country after country, failed to invest in the interior. So let's just pause on that for a moment and unpack it. You go to Latin America, you got along the eastern spine, the great Andes Mountains, sort of like the Swiss Alps, but higher. And that, as we said, referring back to Switzerland, mountains both protect, but they also make trade extremely difficult, along with conquest. And then if you go to the northern part of South America, you've got the vast jungle, impenetrable jungle of the Amazon, filled with an extraordinary diversity of life, but because of its impenetrability, much of it to the present day is impenetrable. And the only thing that the farmers do is kind of burn away the jungle because there's no way to penetrate it and use it for agriculture. You look around Latin America, and with very few exceptions, like Buenos Aires and so forth. But if you go up the eastern coast of the western coast of Latin America, they don't have the deep natural harbors that they do in Europe and in the United States and many parts of Asia. So you have a situation which was complicated by the fact that the Spanish and the Portuguese, who took that part of the world, while the British and the French were concentrating on North America, and the British bringing in this economic model of the small landowner, the Spanish had their great land holding estates, thousands and thousands of square acres, reducing the natives to serfs and slaves, extracting the resources, the gold, the copper, all the different metals, and then shipping them back to Europe, continuing to impoverish that region until in the 1820s and the 1830s. As you recall, you had Simón Bolívar from Bolivia overthrow the Spanish landlords and the colonial regime, aspiring, like the Americans had just done between 1776 and 1783. They had overthrown the British, but they united as a single country. The 13 colonies united as a single country. It's very important. And Simón Bolívar, seeing this, tried tirelessly for decades, throwing the Spanish out of one country after another, but he could not unite. Even though there was a common language and a common colonial inheritance, he couldn't unite the Latin Americans because of the legacy of the Spanish colonial period and because of geography. The distances were just so intractable as the jungle and the mountains and the contrary rivers played themselves out. And so Latin America has always hoped for unity, but has never achieved it because they cannot surmount geography. Now, let me just make a few concluding remarks. And because of time, I concentrated on sort of America and Russia, and then Africa and Latin America. I didn't deal with Asia to speak of, but I will just make a footnote about China. China, too, has been constrained by geography. And it's one of the reasons why China has endured longer than any other country by many orders of magnitude. Just to give you an example, the United States is just going on 250 years old. China is over 5,000 years old. So China has been a continuous entity 20 times longer than the United States. Take that in. The Chinese have been a definable entity country 20 times longer than the United States. And they've learned a few things, but it came from their geography. If you look at China, over the 5,000 years, it's basically stayed within its geographical constraints. It's very interesting. China is one of the few great powers that has never attacked anybody outside of their periphery. They tried to get up into Korea, and for a while they controlled Korea. They tried to get into Japan, never could get across the water in a sufficiently organized way. They went down into Vietnam to probe, but they never sent troops or ships across the Pacific to take North America. They never sent military armadas to India or to Europe to take it over. Because the Chinese realized that they had a vast territory. They have the Himalayas to the west and to the south. They have jungle to the south and to the east. They have the vast frozen steppes of Siberia to the north. They have the great deserts, the Gobi Desert in the northeast, where Xinjiang province and so forth are. So over time, they realized that they could endure as a great power, in part because they were satisfied for where they were. They didn't develop an imperial tradition as such, as we've seen in Europe or the United States, for example, or in ancient Rome or Greece, where they just went out to conquer everything they could possibly imagine, like Alexander the Great. The Chinese have never done that. They've been constrained by their geography. And one of the reasons why they've lasted so long is because they've understood that military adventurism always ends in failure, like against the Japanese, like against the Vietnamese, and occasionally against the Russians and the Arabs during the heyday of the Arab power. Now, why is this important? And why do I want to end with China? What is China doing while the United States, this great naval power, seeks to ensure global military supremacy over the entire planet, and is now taking on one superpower with Russia and is also taking on China? What's China been doing for the last 30 years? They've been building the Silk Road. China had very good trading relations with India, with the Arab states, with Russia, with Turkey, with India, with Southeast Asia, through trade. The Chinese understand something that the Americans have yet to even imagine. And that is, if you want to live long, you want to be basically prosperous, you trade with people. You don't make war with people. So as the US, with its balloons and everything, that's been this spasm in the media over the last couple of days, shoots anything that moves in the air, China is just quietly building an economic network, the Silk Road, around the world. And what's happening is that Russia and China and India, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Brazil, and other countries, as the US engages in incessant war, they're building an economic security zone that is beginning to trade outside the US dollar in a friendly and fraternal way. So one of the things that's happening as these geographies come into conflict, and on the one hand, you've got the United States, which has been in perpetual war since 1941. For the last 82 years, the United States has been in perpetual war. Vietnam and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and the Balkans and Panama and Dominican Republic and you name it, dozens of times, overthrowing governments, establishing military juntas, et cetera, et cetera. China has been saying to people, just relax, take the long view. The United States is going to spin itself out, and we'll still be here as your trading partner because we want to invite you to be part of the Silk Road. I believe, to add my conjecture to all this, I believe that the war in Ukraine will go down in history as that moment where the world realized that the militarism of the United States, the coercive neoliberalism of US economics, no longer serves. And that what we're witnessing is the death knell of American primacy around the world, and the beginning of a new multipolar aggregation of interests around the metaphor of the Silk Road, that over time, over the next several decades, assuming we don't go to nuclear exchange, which is highly probable given what's happening, that the primacy of the US dollar will erode because the Saudis have now announced, in partnership with Russia, in partnership with China and with India, that oil will begin to be sold in currencies other than the US dollar. As Russia and China and the rest of the world come into a gradual coalition of interests, not predicated on military primacy, but predicated on the primacy of trade. And if we're graced, in 20, 30 years, America will reside in the ash heap of empire, as another empire like the Assyrians and many empires of old that thought that through military conquest and colonialism they could rule supreme. But those empires always fall, and they're always consumed by their own iniquity and the reality that the militarism that they seek to spread abroad to consume more than their fair share ends up infecting their internal politics. And what happens as the imperium goes into decay, there's a greater and greater disparity between the rich and the poor, which destroys any sense of civic virtue. And the imperium collapses. And what we're seeing today as geography and politics interpenetrate one another is the collapse of the Pax Americana and the emergence of a multipolar world shaped by geography in an incontrovertible way. So I think I'll end there. Thank you for your attention on these matters. And I'll open it up to questions, I'd like to hear from our doctoral students. I know this is the one course at Ubiquity that we open to the public. So many of you are just taking this as a free course, and I want to welcome you. You're also welcome to ask any questions or make any comments. So I'd like to see our students raise their hands, and let's engage in a dialogue. Okay, I'm going to call on someone. I'm going to call on Linda White. Linda, anything you want to say? Any questions, any comments? I'm going to promote you to panelist because I know she's one of our students, you see. Linda, anything you want to say? Anyone want to comment?
Can you hear me?
There we go. Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm actually driving, and I pulled over because I'm so enthralled. I've been listening to the whole thing, and I pulled over because I wanted to figure out how on my iPhone to talk. So thank you so much for calling on me. Jim, it's absolutely brilliant what you just brought forth. As you know, I'm doing my dissertation on war as collective addiction and how it's relates to the social ills in the United States, and I'm staying very US centric. And I must have spent a whole day trying to figure out how to bring in what you so clearly laid out today about the colonization and the enslavement. And I guess I do have a question. Where I got caught up was, and I'm sharing my own biography on nuclear missiles, my father being in the middle office. My maternal grandparents being Russian and Ukrainian or Austrian. What I was struggling with was sorting out how to language the Europeans that came over as conquerors and then the immigrants. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, and I know it has to do with the timeline, but that the Europeans came over and conquered the land. And then of course there was the colonization and there was the enslavement or the slavery. But then the melting pot is what I was circling around, that, we're a melting pot of cultures, and that relationship between the immigrants, who were escaping war and coming from, poverty, and then those that were actually coming that were funded, to conquer.
Oh, very good question. Thank you, Linda. Let's probe that for a moment, and let me fill out what Linda was saying, that you have the Europeans that were colonizing literally the rest of the planet. And they come over to North America and they end up in a melting pot. And there were two reasons for that, among many, but two principal reasons. One is that, as Linda was pointing out, most of the Europeans that came were poor, were marginalized, were looking to get out of wherever it was they were. And they heard these unbelievably fantastic stories about the New Jerusalem and the Promised Land, and that if you could get yourself on a boat and spend a couple of weeks going across the Atlantic, you could land in this country that was so vast. Everything was possible. You could own land. So many of the Europeans, I would say 90% of the Europeans that came over were poor, marginal, and seeking to escape where they were. And they came in and they realized, my God, this is what I can do here is impossible back in France or Germany and so forth and so on. Let me give you an example out of my own life. My ancestors on my father's side were Huguenots, and they were French Protestants. And during, the 100 Years' War and after the Reformation, when the Catholics and the Protestants were killing each other, they were Protestants in Catholic France. And during the reign of Louis the 14th, he's the only monarch that ruled longer than Queen Elizabeth II, in part because he came to the throne when he was 7 years old. Elizabeth came when she was 25. He threw out the Huguenots. He massacred many of them and then threw them out. And if you've read Barbara Tuchman's work, March of Folly, The History of Stupidity from Troy to Vietnam, she points out that what the French did was decapitate their entrepreneurial class. Wow. Many of the Huguenots went to Germany, and that's one reason why the Germans became such a powerful machine. They were Protestant, but they welcomed entrepreneurial people. And there was a certain group of Huguenots that in 1686 came to North Carolina. So that's an example of a persecuted minority that fled, ended up in North America, and little old me is one of their descendants on my father's side. On my mother's side, they were from Palermo in Sicily, but they were so poor and they had no hope of any future that somebody said to them, go to America. And a couple of them went. They settled in San Francisco and they started to send back messages. Hey, guys, we've established businesses in San Francisco. Come to San Francisco. And so my grandmother and her parents came to San Francisco and got jobs and were doing all this stuff. But this is an example, and almost every American can tell you some story about some immigrant can tell you some story of a similar nature. Then secondly, back to my point on geography, when they get here, they find out that the stories are all true. They're in the richest region in the world. And they all get 40 acres and a mule. And they have from the Atlantic to the Pacific to settle in. Can you imagine? It was like people going to heaven. So people flocked to the United States. And in one of the great ironies of history, even though we were completely racist and genocidal against the native peoples using black slave labor, for all the Caucasians that came, whether it was France or Germany or Ireland or Italy or wherever, they were essentially welcomed. There was some discrimination against the Irish and the Italians and so forth as they came in. But by and large, the wealth of the country allowed all boats to rise. And that is a story that can't be said about any other country in history. Say, take China, for example. People don't immigrate to China. You know, you don't immigrate to Nigeria. You don't immigrate to Russia. There's no real reason to go there unless you have a specific personal reason, like you're going to get married or you have a particular job and so forth. It's only the United States that has been this magnet to people. And then there was from China, even Africa, India. Half of Silicon Valley is from either China or India. That's one reason we call it the brain drain. The greatness of the United States has been the brain drain. There have been more Nobel laureates from the United States than any other country by several multiples. And almost all of them were born outside the United States. Think about that. We have more Nobel laureates than anybody, and almost all of them were born somewhere else. That's both the contradiction and paradox of the United States, but one of the reasons why it's become such a great power. And the great tragedy is that it's wasting everything on war. So thank you for that question, Linda. Is there anything else anybody would like to say? I see here Claire Milne. I was taught by Chinese students living in my home that the territory that is mainland China today was historically 18 different cultural identities, all left without an identity beyond Chinese, and specifically with cultural and linguistic characteristics systematically oppressed by the Chinese government. This narrative has echoes in the biographical narrative, the novel Wild Swans, about 3 generations of a Chinese family. Yeah, I think that's true, although I think, Claire, to that point, it's been the Han ethnic group that constitutes about 80% of China. China, unlike the United States, has been relatively ethnically homogenous. But there's a good 20%, including the Uyghurs, who came from Turkey and migrated during the Middle Ages and the early European period to China as they were fleeing war in Turkey. You have in China, because of its vastness, ethnic minorities in addition to the Han, but the Chinese civilization over the thousands of years has been remarkably stable, even when it was invaded by the Mongols. In the 13th centuries, the Mongols came out of Mongolia and swept into China as they swept into the Middle East and up into Russia. You know, the Mongols controlled Russia for over 200 years. And they set up the Song dynasty in China. Excuse me, it wasn't the Song dynasty. It was called something else. I can't remember at the moment. But then they were gradually just absorbed into China and melted without a trace. So that is something for you to consider as we contemplate how geography influences the rest of the world. So that might be all we, the Yuan dynasty, thank you, the Yuan dynasty, that's what it was. And it was the Song dynasty that outlasted it. That's it. So the Southern Song. So I think that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. I hope my remarks have been illuminating. I hope that you'll, on this Valentine's Day, will be empathetic to those areas of the world not geographically as well endowed as other regions. We will understand more about how the Russians are feeling about what's going on in Ukraine. We'll understand more about how the Chinese and the Africans and the Latin Americans and the Americans have evolved the way they do. And hope that through this mutual understanding, we will have peace on earth. I want to just say, announce that next month, we're going to have a lecture on one of the great works. This was really one of the great works of human history, The Golden Ass of Apuleius. And that was written in the Roman imperial time. It's really an homage to the great goddess Isis. And so we're going to have Mariam Sayad, one of the great mythologists who's talked to us on a number of occasions on Humanity Rising, and has actually done a couple courses for our wisdom school on the great feminine, is going to be sharing the book that she considers one of the most fascinating in all of antiquity, the Golden Ass of Apuleius. It's a story of this guy who transgresses the sacred feminine, and she reduces him to being embodied inside a donkey. So he has human intelligence, but he's in the body of a donkey until he learns his lesson. It's a great work. So that'll be the second Tuesday of March and April, and then we'll move on from there. So happy Valentine's, everyone. Thank you all so much. Enjoy your day, and we'll see you next month.